can you please talk about yourself, who you are and what you're doing? Thank you.
Great. So I'm Chris Maclay. I'm the program director of the Jobtech Alliance. The Jobtech Alliance is Africa, Pan-African ecosystem building initiative, trying to promote the job tech or inclusive job tech sector. What is job tech? It is any platform or tech startup whose core focus is helping people to earn money. This could be a gig matching platform, a job matching platform, an e-commerce platform, or maybe a creator platform that helps young creatives to earn money. So any startups where the core of them is helping young Africans to make money. So we do two things in this space. We do kind of all of the soft side of ecosystem building or systems change, a lot of research, a lot of community building. We run an investor network. We kind of look for the systemic constraints that hold back this sector and seek to change them. And on the second side of things, we provide what we call venture support, which is a little bit like acceleration, where we help individual high potential startups to grow through kind of consulting support and grow in different ways that create more jobs for their users. We then learn from these engagements and share that learning back with the ecosystem.
Fascinating. So you spent 3 years as a COO at Linkenia, and this is a for-profit startup. And before coming back to the NGO nonprofit world. Now, what did you learn about how business actually create jobs that you could not have learned inside an NGO?
Hard it is probably the biggest learning. I think there's a lot, I mean, a quite incomprehensibly big amount that I learned. I mean, I'll try and break it apart a bit. One thing is just the basics of numbers. I think when you live in the like employment space or in the NGO space, you're often very used to these kind of big numbers and like, you know, we reach this many people, or we touch this many people, or we claim we created this many people because it kind of came through lots of different things we did. But when you're in the real granularity of a job creating business, it is hard to create a job. It is equally hard to sustain that job. And I think one of the big kind of things that often in NGO projects is you look at like a moment in time where you're like, we've now created this job. But you don't necessarily look at that job then over time and see if it's being sustained. Because to then create a second job, you need to, it's almost like you're now creating two jobs, right? You need to create the amount of work that sustains the first and add the second. And then to create 10 jobs, you need to sustain the previous ones and add more. And I think it's a really obvious and basic thing, but I think NGO projects, which are so moment in time, typically don't really look at that kind of the depth behind the numbers. And a lot of my I look at a lot of my early career and look at some of the things that I was told numbers and I believed without really interrogating them. To give you a super basic example, you say like we've created jobs for, you know, there's one platform right now that says they have 60,000 beauticians earning $500 a month. Now, sounds great. If you just do the very basic maths on that, that would mean that they as a platform are delivering a beauty job to every man, woman, and child in Nairobi every week, which is not possible. But like, I think we often don't question numbers properly. We don't really kind of interrogate how hard it is and what it means to really create jobs. I think we warm like flies to a light around these big numbers, but don't really interrogate what lives within those numbers. I think that's one really significant thing. What else did I learn? I mean, just everything about how real business works, right? So from how the funding infrastructure works, how decision making and incentives work, how the mechanics of running businesses, it's just a very different kind of kettle of fish.
Great, thank you. Following question. Jobtech Alliance works by supporting digital labor platforms, Uber, TaskRabbit, these kind of things, of the global south. A lot of development people are kind of suspicious of the gig economy. How do you think about the difference between platform that exploits informal workers and one that genuinely builds livelihood, this sustainability that you
Yeah.
just mentioned?
It's a fantastic question. So the platform economy or job tech sector in a lot of Western markets is very structurally different from the platform economy in a lot of African markets. Um, what are the big differences? So start with number one, the typical vision of a platform like Uber in the US. It took a job that used to be full time with a range of benefits and break it up into informal gigs with none of the above. It's important to recognize that in most economies of Africa, those formal jobs with benefits never existed, and where a lot of these platforms exist in the informal sector, it's actually more of a stepping stone into formality rather than a stepping stone into informality. That's just more of a positioning thing. It's not what necessarily makes it great, but I think it's a kind of different starting point. One other thing is uh, platforms in the US typically, or a lot of Western markets, operate by solving at its core for information asymmetry, right? You already have a functioning labor market, right? A plumber matching platform has a plumber who has accreditation, a van, tools, access to high quality materials, soft skills, you name it. And a customer who's willing to pay. So what the platform does is it just improves the information that helps the customer find the provider and vice versa. In Africa, you have a broken labor market, right? That same plumber does not have accreditation. They might not have the soft skills. They almost definitely don't have the assets. They get ripped off. They don't have a van and need to get around on public transport. They get ripped off trying to, get materials. Just providing and then they have a customer who doesn't have a lot of disposable income and is just looking for the cheapest thing available, right? So just by adding an information layer does not solve that broken labor market. This means that a job tech platform in Africa needs to look very different. And typically, in order to survive, operate in Africa, the platform takes on the role of what we typically might think of as NGO work, government responsibilities, to do asset financing, to skill and accredit, to provide PPE, to work on, what is the scalable transportation solution for plumbers. So all of this means that it's the kind of operating models are often very different. One thing of what I just described is in Africa, we typically see platforms as being smaller, focused on solving for labor market failures, as opposed to the kind of North American model, which is all about scale and margins and all of that. And it just means the kind of structure of the platform economy can look very, very different here, as well as the value that they give to workers is so much greater, right? Because they're solving for these labor market pain points. I could keep going, but these are just some of the very different kind of structural elements between these different markets.
Fascinating. I didn't know all that. And wow, it's a daunting task, but you're amazing. You're doing it. So a question for the people who are going to see these. So you watched a lot of NGOs and NGOs programs partner with the private sector, the for-profit sector, and fail. What's the single biggest mistake you think NGOs make when they try to engage with the private sector and they keep making?
I'd say there's kind of two parts of a connected thing. One of them goes back to my earlier point of this fundamentals of the numbers. I'll tell you a scenario that I've seen a lot. An NGO has a program working in northeastern Nigeria, really tough area and they're like, we need to bring the private sector in. And they find this really cool, innovative startup operating in Lagos. Now, two things often go wrong in this scenario. One of them is that they kind of misread the potential impact because, this platform says, oh yeah, we have 10,000 users. They don't really unpack what that 10,000 users means. It might be that they only have like 50 people earning regularly, for example. So that they kind of start from very a very different starting point. Secondly, they say, this startup, it's, maybe early stage, is looking for some kind of non-dilutive capital, is the kind of startup term for a grant. And they say, yeah, we can do it. But then, their business model is still struggling to work in Lagos, let alone up in Maiduguri. So what then happens is the initiative kind of struggles to take off in Maiduguri because it's an incredibly difficult market in Maiduguri, but often it undermines or distracts the private sector itself from kind of its core. The NGO doesn't really understand the stage of the business or the capacity of the business to operate in this kind of new environment, reaching more vulnerable groups, entering a new geography. And it both kind of means that the engagement doesn't benefit their target participants in that area, but it also often distracts or hurts the business that loses its focus because it's trying to get access to this non-dilutive capital.
Wow. So the following question, how would it be, the best ways for NGO to approach this type of work? Now that you experienced it, what would be the best or the least worst way to approach this?
Can I just ask a clarification question?
Yes, please.
Is this kind of in line with the last question of the ones that you sent around before of kind of how to interact with the private sector, or more related to there being a funding cliff, or do you mean more kind of if you're intervening itself?
That is correct, is in line, and how you would, so it will, what you're saying, what you will say, it will give an indication to NGOs for future way to properly engage with the private sector.
I mean, broadly, and this might sound a little bit spicy, but I think NGOs have spent a lot of time being okay with mediocrity and kind of surviving in a space of kind of mediocre performance where they're doing okay work. Sometimes it's great, but it's kind of okay. When working with certain parts of the private sector, and I should recognize that, if we're talking about kind of seed distributors, a lot of those guys can be quite old school and there's a lot of opportunity to kind of work there. But particularly if you're working with startups, working with anyone more kind of adjacent to the kind of the tech space, it could be fintech, agritech, or Jobtech, you name it. We're typically working with really, really smart entrepreneurs, right? They might have worked at Google before. They're typically filled with ideas, filled with capacity. And in order to be able to help them, work with them, you also need to be really good. I'll give you a kind of a little anecdote. We often when you're hiring someone, right, everyone wants a 10 out of 10, but if you get a 7 out of 10, fine, you'll get 70% of the work. Now, if you're trying to work with the private sector to help them improve their services in a way that then benefits their kind of the target demographics that you're reaching for, if the founder, the entrepreneur is an 8 or a 9, you need to be a 9 or a 10, or you're a 0. Right, a 7 out of 10 is a 0. It is then only it's a distraction. It's a frustration. It's At best, it's plus zero, but at worst, it's a distraction. So, I think if one wants to interact really well with the private sector, one needs really great people. And I think it's not just about saying like, I think can be a bit of we need to hire people from the private sector. And I think it's not just about hiring people from the private sector. There's a lot of mediocrity in the private sector as well. And I think sometimes when NGOs say, let's hire people from the private sector, they don't necessarily have the frameworks to determine what is a good versus a bad person. But I think there isn't enough of an acknowledgement that if you want to be really driving change from kind of high potential or high growth private sector actors, you need top tier talent. And I think we don't necessarily recognize that, like, if you're working at the pointy end of the spear, you need to be as pointy as the stakeholders that you're working with.
Fantastic. Appreciate your candor. Thank you. So another question. Now, I think a lot of development professionals, what they feel but really don't say out loud. So the NGO model itself, it's like a combination of donor dependency and then kind of risk aversion, this mediocre level, or okay, just good enough. And like short-term cycle project, what you just mentioned. Okay, let's create this job, and then once we take the picture and then let's move on to something else. Now, this is kind of structurally incompatible with the real market engagement, especially for the private sector, which is long term. In order to survive, they want to continue to make a profit, and in order to make a profit, they may have to change, constantly adapting. And it seems that NGOs are not built for this. How do you struggle, factor in, consider these tension?
As the Jobtech Alliance, or kind of my perspectives of it?
Both, please. Well, what you experienced at Jobtech, and then what you understood from the ecosystem.
So, I mean, your articulation is, I think, absolutely flawless, right? The kind of structure and incentive model and accountability model of the NGO sector is completely not fit for purpose. Everything, how, our focus on outputs rather than outcomes from a starting point, and how we're structured, our inflexibility from operations, from an activities perspective, through to the time horizon. I think it's why the NGO sector is the kind of the meta of the scenario that we find ourselves in from a funding perspective. I think some of it is justified is not the wrong word. I think the way it's happened is not the right way, but like there is a lot of truth in a lot of the kind of frustration of the sector. But it's not that there's not good, nice people working really hard. It's just that the structures of the system that we've set up are not suitable for the kind of social change that we want and need to see. Maybe a few things, because the Jobtech Alliance is housed within Mercy Corps, right? We work entirely with the startups in the private sector, but we are housed within an international NGO. I think we do a reasonably good job of navigating this, and I can share a few of the things that we've done without having said that we've nailed it. Number one is, when we started, we said this is a 10-year initiative. We didn't have money for 10 years. we had money for we had a few grants for 1 year, a few for 3. But we said from day one, like, you don't build an ecosystem in 10 years. We don't build an ecosystem in 3 years. It's at least a 10-year initiative. And we made principles at the start. And indeed, one of our cultural values is think long-term, act short-term. And because we know that you have to be building for a long-term horizon, right? We need to move quickly and change quickly and act based on immediate opportunities, but always with the context of a long-term horizon. The grants that we get together, we tie into one initiative rather than kind of treating as bilateral or standalone projects. One, if you want like a little I don't know, a tip is the right term, but one thing that we do on a quarterly basis is we bring together all of our funders into a donor steering group. Indeed, mine is happening in 90 minutes today. But the purpose of this is to take our donors away from their kind of bilateral activity-based kind of counting and help them see the bigger picture. And it has been absolutely transformative in some cases because whereas you particularly when maybe you have a new grant or a new contract and it takes a while to start seeing results. If you only had a bilateral relationship, they might be kind of saying this isn't working. But when they see the whole and they see how it all fits together, it really builds a lot of confidence and gives us a lot of flexibility to say, hey, we've been keeping you abreast of the broader strategy. We want to change this now. They give us flexibility to do so, and they kind of have a lot more confidence. Similarly, we make sure we structure all of our agreements to focus on the right things. Incidentally, a number of our grants are structured as contract or performance-based grants, which, of course, Mercy Corps, the institution, hates. The Jobtech Alliance team love because it keeps us focused and keeps us honest. And it's been I think it's been great to kind of keep us focused on the right thing.
Fantastic. Thank you again. This is gold for people in NGOs. Last question. Now, if you had 5 minutes with the CEO of a mid-sized NGO that is facing funding problems now, gigantic funding problems, and the person feels that there is a need to change, what would you advise that person to do first?
Learn what you are the best at. I think this relates quite a lot to kind of our earlier conversation about kind of the NGO sector often being quite kind of comfortable with mediocrity, right? We do a lot of things reasonably well. We kind of take on lots of different grants in order to, cover our costs and do different things. But the whole, foundation of the private sector is you need to be the best, right? Particularly if you're trying to be a growth organization, or you're trying to kind of revolutionize an industry, or you're trying to, which is what we're trying to do in the social change space. We're not trying to just deliver something. We're typically trying to cause societal change in one way, shape, or form. That means you need to be the best at something. And I think we often kind of say, all right, yeah, we do a lot of things, and maybe we come up with a mission statement that ties it all together. But we don't ask the really, really difficult question of what are we literally the best at? Not just the best in our field versus other NGOs, but related to our conversation earlier, where is the area that we can add value to each and every stakeholder we engage with, right? Is it livestock in the Sahel region where we know more than anyone else, and we can bring together the knowledge, the stakeholders, then if you're looking to change and bring on new forms of capital to change, you really need to be the best. You need to offer value. And I think that's the first thing that needs to happen, is that self-analysis to say, where are we really the best?
Fantastic. Beautiful. Chris, thank you so much for this. Is so insightful and inspiring. And we can stop the recording here.